We are on Vav Amud Beis 26b, and we're really in the middle of a discussion, almost the middle of a sentence, really. What we're discussing is the Mishnah, which told us that the verse which says that in order to qualify as a Sotah, the man about which she is being warned must be an Ish. Or to reframe that, in order for the warning to be valid and have any halachic ramification that would begin the Sotah process, the person about which she's being warned must be an Ish, the Hebrew word Ish. And the question becomes, what's the definition of an Ish? Who qualifies as an Ish? Ish translating as man, but as we explained yesterday, it doesn't mean the English term man or human. It means the specific halachic categorization of Ish, considering that the word man in English has many different terms in biblical text, Adam, Gever, and Ish. And the question is, who qualifies as Ish? Now, our Mishnah told us that from the fact that the verse says Ish, he has to warn her about an Ish, that disqualifies a warning about a child, a minor. A minor doesn't qualify as an Ish. So if the husband warned his wife not to seclude herself with a minor, the warning is of no consequence. And if she secluded herself with him, maybe it isn't appropriate, but it doesn't render her a Sotah. And then the Mishnah also said, and likewise, Umisha Enoy Ish, if he warns her about secluding herself with someone who is not an Ish. So we're looking to find who is this person that is an adult male and yet doesn't qualify as Ish. That's what we're looking for. The first suggestion the Gemara told us yesterday was a person called a shachuf, someone who is ill or sick, that renders him incapable of complete sexual activity. And perhaps he doesn't qualify as Ish. And we rejected that because Shmuel told us that a shachuf, this person who's capable of some sexual activity, but not completely, this person does qualify as Ish, even though in two instances where the Torah uses the word Ish, in the law of the Sotah, as well as the law of a person who, based on who he is, would render a woman stripped of her Kohanic privileges if they were intimate. There too, the verse says, Ki yiyala ish zar, if she will be with a foreign Ish, if she is intimate with, if this daughter of a Kohen is intimate with someone that she's not supposed to be intimate with, then that intimacy strips her of her Kohanic privilege. So there too, we have the same classification, who is an Ish. And Shmuel told us that in both instances, in the case of the man who, because of his lineage, he's not Jewish or is born of an illegitimate relationship, whatever it is, that makes him a person that if he were intimate with a daughter of a Kohen, he would render her invalid, would strip her of her Kohanic privileges. In that case, because the Torah says Ish, and there Shmuel says even a shachuf, if she lay with a shachuf, if she lay with this person who is ill, then that would render her stripped of her Kohanic privilege, as well as the Sotah. If a husband warned his wife against secluding herself with a shachuf, this would qualify as her as a Sotah, even though both instances it's a question of intimacy, and he's lacking in his intimacy. But nonetheless, he's still an Ish. He's still capable of some intimacy, and therefore qualifies. So if you went back to square one, who is this person that the Mishnah says is not an Ish? And therefore warning his wife about this person would be of no consequence. And intimacy with this person, that is a daughter of a Kohen who has intimacy with this person, would not render her stripped of her Kohanic privileges because this person is not an Ish. So who is that? The suggestion we left with yesterday, which we were in the middle of discussing, is a non-Jew. Certainly inappropriate, but if it doesn't qualify as the halachic category of Ish, then warning his wife about secluding herself with a non-Jew would not render her a Sotah. And a daughter of a Kohen who would be intimate with a non-Jew would not render her stripped of her Kohanic privileges. if this is indeed true, that a non-Jew doesn't qualify as ish. To which we quoted Rabbi Hamnuna, which said, no, a non-Jew does qualify as ish. And therefore, a husband who warns his wife against secluding herself with a non-Jew, that would render her a sotah if she were to violate that warning. The warning is valid. And likewise, if the daughter of a Kohen was intimate with a non-Jew, that would strip her of her Kohanic privileges. Now, this is where we're going. To that, the Gemara said, is it not obvious? Is it not obvious? If he's an ish, then why shouldn't it? Why shouldn't it work? Why shouldn't he be a kind of person about whom a warning is valid? Why shouldn't he be someone who renders a daughter of a Kohen in stripped of her Kohanic privileges? So the Gemara said, when it comes to the law of the Sotah, so if I'm going too fast, please stop me. Yeah, so far so good? Okay, so the Gemara said that when it comes to the law of the Sotah, one of the consequences of Sotah is that as a result of her promiscuous behavior, she is now forbidden to be married to the person about which she was warned. That's one of the consequences of Sotah. Now, I might have mistakenly thought that this consequence is a qualifier, meaning you can only qualify as a Sotah if the person about whom you're being warned is one that will, after this warning, become forbidden to you, as opposed to a non-Jew who you were always forbidden to marry. And therefore, Nuna says, no. When there's the consequence of the Sotah proceeding or the Sotah law, that she's no longer allowed to marry this person that she was suspected with, that's just a consequence. It's not a qualifier. And therefore, she could be warned about secluding herself with someone who she was never allowed to marry, a non-Jew, similar to what we talked about when we learned about the siblings or the familiar relations. Now, when it comes to a daughter of a Kohen, and Rav Hamnuna told us that because a non-Jew qualifies as ish, if she was intimate with a non-Jew, she would be stripped of her Kohanic privilege. The Gemara asked again, is that not obvious? Is it not obvious if he's an ish? Obviously, he renders her stripped of her Kohanic privileges. So answers the Gemara, when the verse describes the intimacy of this daughter of a Kohen and this foreign man, this foreign ish, the Torah uses the word kitihiyeh, when she shall be with. This term tiyeh, be with, implies a marital relation, an exclusive marital relation, not just an intimate physical one. Now, obviously, if she's intimate with this person, it's not only if they're married, but perhaps, again, this is a qualifier. I might have thought to mean that what is the kind of person that would render her stripped of her Kohanic privilege? Only the kind of person who she could marry. But a person with whom marriage would never take effect in halachic reasoning, this is not the kind of person that intimacy would render her stripped of her Kohanic privilege. And this is the case of a non-Jew. A non-Jew who marries a Jew does not need to go through halachic divorce because they were never halachically married. Just like a brother and a sister who acted like they were married don't need to go through a divorce because they were never halachically married. And this is not the same case as, say, a Jew marrying or a Kohen, let's say, marrying a divorcee, where he's not supposed to marry her. But if they didn't marry, they'd have to go through divorce because the marriage took effect. So perhaps then I might have thought that the only people who rendered this woman stripped of her Kohanic privilege if they were intimate is only the kind of person that she could marry. But a non-Jew who she can't marry doesn't render her lost of her Kohanic privilege, even though, of course, it's an inappropriate behavior. So that's the mistaken reasoning I would have thought. To which Rav Hamnuna replies and says, no, the non-Jew qualifies as ish, and therefore, if she's intimate with a non-Jew, she loses her Kohanic privileges, even though she can't marry her, or she can't marry him.
So that verse, is it a verse or it's the mission? It says, she shall be.
It's a verse, kitiya, it's a verse.
The verse, the mission is stating?
The Gemara is analyzing this.
So there, Rav Hamnuna is saying that it's from this verse
that you might have made the mistake.
Might have made a mistake.
From that verse, you might have made the mistake.
Saying, even if it's a non-Jew or a brother, sister, a relationship that we would not ordinarily allow to be married to.
That would still render her.
Still render her Sotah, still render her a daughter of a Kohen who
Correct.
Her privileges.
Correct.
Even in those cases.
Correct. Even though their marriage would never take effect if they would get married.
So it's not really a qualifier, it's a consequence.
It just happens to be, yeah. Yes, correct. Okay, so now this is where we are right now. And now the Gemara is going to cite to Rabbi Yochanan, who gives us a scriptural proof to this idea that even someone who she's not allowed to marry, namely a non-Jew, if she was intimate with him, she would lose her Kohanic status. She would lose her Kohanic privileges. We're going to go to a scriptural proof to this notion. This is where we are.
Oh, so that other verse wasn't scriptural proof.
It was a scriptural mistake. It was a mistaken reading of the scriptural text.
It was a mistaken reading. But
that's right.
We're going to have something more definitive.
We're going to have a much more direct verse to indicate to us that even though she cannot marry him, she would still lose her Kohanic privileges. That's right. So let's see. Me, the Rabbi Yochanan.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And therefore, would be considered.
And therefore, he qualifies as ish. And therefore, that's right. That's right, because the verse uses the same term ish. So whoever qualifies an ish for making a woman lose her Kohanic privilege would also qualify as an ish in terms of being warned for a Sotah. It's the same word. That's right. That's correct. It's a question of definition. What's the legal definition of ish? So if we can go to anywhere in Torah where it uses the word ish and see what works. So I'm not familiar with all scripture, so I don't know other laws, but the Gemara cites these two, and it would seem to me that this is the reason why. Okay, so let's see. Mid Rabbi Yochanan, this is supported by Rabbi Yochanan, this notion that her intimacy with a non-Jew, even though she can't marry him, would render her stripped of her Kohanic privileges, the daughter of a Kohen who is intimate with a non-Jew. This is based on a teaching of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan, for Rabbi Yochanan said, Mishum Rabbi Yishmael, the name of Rabbi Yishmael. So I think I've mentioned this in the past. Rabbi Yochanan is in the generation that links the Tanaic age, the age of the Gemara, and the Amaraic age, the age of the Mishnah, and the Amaraic age, the age of the Gemara. So Rabbi Yochanan, although he is technically not a scholar of the Mishnah, here he's speaking in the name of a scholar of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yishmael. He's that link. So Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, how do we know that a non-Jew, the Eved or a slave, both of whom, if they married a Jew, married a Jewish girl, Kohen or not, that marriage would be meaningless and valueless, and there would be no need for a divorce, legally speaking, because he's not Jewish or he's a slave. But nonetheless, Shabo ala Kayanis ba'ala Lavia, if they were intimate with a daughter of a Kohen, a daughter of a Levite, Ba'al Yisrael, and a daughter of a Jew, Shepasluha, that would render her stripped of their privileges. Right? Whatever their privileges are, whether it's the privileges of marriage or the privileges of being a Kohen or whatnot. So how do we know this? Shenemar, because the verse reads as follows. The entirety of the verse is like this. Ubas, the Gemara quotes only part of the verse, but here's the rest of the verse. Ubas Kohen, the daughter of a Kohen, Kisia, when she will be Almana, widowed, the Grusha, or divorced, daughter of a Kohen who got married and is now divorced or widowed. Now the verse goes on to say, not quoted in the Gemara, the Zera Ein La, and she has no offspring. I'm reading it from the side of the page here. The Shava al Beis Avia Kanura, she returns to her father's house as she was before she was married. Milechem Avia Toichel, she can eat from her father's bread, meaning to say she can eat truma. So this is the law that the Torah is telling us. Daughter of a Kohen, she can eat truma. She's a member of her father's household. She can eat of the gifts or certain gifts that are offered to the Kohen. As a member of her father's household. She gets married to a non-Kohen, perfectly legitimate marriage, No problem. She was never married before, so there's no issue with this relationship. Completely legal and sanctioned by Torah, a Kohen marrying the daughter of an Israelite. No problem. Now, during her marriage, she cannot eat of the Kohanic foods because she's no longer in the household of a Kohen. She's in the household of an Israelite who she married. Now,
so she no longer knows that
she's no longer, her eating of the Kohen food was because she's part of the Kohanic household, but she's no longer part of the Kohanic household. She married an Israelite. Yeah. Now, if she has children from that relationship, so her children are now Israelites because her husband is an Israelite. And there's a divorce, or her husband dies. Because she had children, she's linked to her ex-husband or deceased husband's household via those children. She's linked to the household of her children who are Israelites, and therefore she cannot eat of the Kohanic food. But if she's divorced or widowed, childless, so she's no longer linked to an Israelite household. She's not married to an Israelite because she's divorced or widowed, and she has no children that are Israelite. So says the Torah, she reverts back to her father's household, returns to the Kohanic household, and she can now eat of the Kohanic foods because she has nothing linking her anymore to her previous marriage to the Israelite household. Okay. So now Rabbi Yochanan, quoting Rabbi Shmuel, tells us the following. Who is the kind of person that after you've been with them, you can still revert back to the Kohanic privilege? That's only mishiyesh loyal manas v'gerushin. Only someone from whom she'd be widowed or divorced. In other words, like this. When she has a legitimately okay marriage, she married an Israelite woman, and she's widowed or divorced, childless, that's when she can revert back to her father's house. But Yotzu, this excludes Ovid Kechavam Ve'eved, a slave or a non-Jew, she'ein loyal manas v'gerushin, where there was no legitimate marriage, and therefore no divorce or being widowed, but from them. Then she cannot go back to her father's household. Following? In other words, because the Torah says, when does a Kohanic woman childless, go back to her father's house to return back to Kohanic privilege, to be part of her father's household? Only if she married someone and was divorced and widowed. What if she was intimate with someone, but there's no divorce, no widowing, because there was no marriage, no legit marriage? Can she then revert back to her father's household? Answer, no. Because Torah says, when does she go back to her father's household? When there's divorce or being widowed. Which means it's only the kind of intimacy that Torah sanctioned and has now been absolved by Torah through death or divorce. So if the marriage was legit by Torah and then dissolved by Torah, she can go back to her father's household. But if the marriage was never sanctioned by Torah altogether, you check that out of your father's house, no longer Kohen. You have no way back in because your way out wasn't legit. Because she was with a non-Jew. And this all is based on the verse, which when describes the Kohanic woman going back to her father's house, describes it as considering the divorce or the widow or her becoming a widow. That's why she goes back to her father's house. Meaning only someone from whom she'd be widowed or someone from whom she'd be divorced, that's when she can go back to her father's house. But if she engaged in a relationship which there's no widow, no divorcing because there was no marriage, then that intimacy renders her detached from her father's Kohanic privilege forever. You stepped out illegally, you can't come back in. You have no legal way back in. It's only when you stepped out legally, married a legitimate relationship, and that same legality that married you into this relationship also absolves you of that relationship, divorce or being widowed. Now you can go back to your Kohanic household. But if you stepped out without any legal parameter to that stepping out, i.e. she was with a non-Jew, then there is no legal absolving of that relationship, and therefore there's no way to go back home. Sorry? That's right. So it's a double-edged sword. Precisely because the marriage never clicked is why she completely stepped out. Because you can only come back home to your father's household if the legalities put you into the relationship and the legalities absolved you of that relationship. But in the case of a woman who was with a non-Jewish guy, there was no legal stepping in, and therefore there's no legal system to get out. And therefore she can't end up back at her father's household. So here's proof from the verse that a woman who's intimate with a non-Jew may not go back to her father's household because that relationship has no legit marriage and therefore has no legit way of absolving the relationship. So all of this to say that a non-Jew qualifies as ish. And therefore when the verse says that a daughter of a Kohen who is intimate with a foreign ish, and as a result of that intimacy cannot go back to her father's house to eat the Kohanic privileges, that includes a non-Jew. That ish includes a non-Jew about whom she can't marry because she can't marry him. And likewise, because the non-Jew qualifies as ish, when the Torah says that a man warns his wife about being intimate or being secluded with an ish, that includes a non-Jew. And therefore, when the Mishnah said that someone who is not an ish doesn't qualify to be warned about, a husband cannot warn his wife about someone who is not an ish, who are we talking about? Who is this non-ish? Ish includes shachuf, includes the person who is sick and cannot engage in full sexual activity. Ish includes a non-Jew. So who is this person that the Mishnah says he may not warn her about a non-ish? Who's the non-ish? Well, we already said the slave counts as an ish, along with non-Jew. So you can't go down that route either.
That's the non-Jew.
Non-Jew and the slave, we just gave the same law just now.
Could it be, I don't know, is it proper to suggest something now? Or
you can suggest if you want to see if you...
No, I was just thinking, what about the converts? What if this non-Jew converted?
When? After their intimacy?
Is there like some kind of
after the intimacy?
retroactive designation?
I don't know. Like if she was intimate with a non-Jew and then he converted, I don't think it would make a difference.
No, I
Let's see. The Gemara is going to give an answer that I don't think we would have thought of on our own.
Mm-hmm.
So Ve'ela, but now, Lamute Mai, what are we excluding? Who is this non-ish that the warning...
Part free?
Part free, part slave?
I don't know.
Gemara doesn't bring it up. So let's see. But so now what are we excluding? Who is the non-ish about whom a warning would be of no consequence? Amar Papa says, Lamute behema, comes to exclude an animal. This comes to exclude an animal. He cannot, or if he warns her about secluding herself with an animal, it's of no consequence. And she secludes herself with the animal, she doesn't become a Sotah. Why is that? The ain znus the behema. If a woman is, God forbid, engages in bestiality, it does not render her a, quote, halachic zayna. Again, this is where the English terminology, I'm going to reload the page here. The English terminologies fail us a little bit because zayna is often translated as like a prostitute or a harlot, right? But that's not the right terminology. Because again, these things, it's the right terminology, but these things, again, have halachic definitions, legal definitions with legal consequences, just like the ish. So what is the definition of a zayna? A woman who does this. So the answer to that is that only a woman who engages intimately with another human qualifies as a zayna. So a woman who does bestiality, as horrible and as terrible as it is, it does not fall into the halachic rubric of, quote, a zayna. And therefore, a woman who engaged in bestiality doesn't become forbidden to her husband with that act, because that doesn't make her a zayna. It's a terrible thing, and they probably should divorce, and she should probably go to therapy. But that's all a social question. It's not a question of the halacha, of the Jewish legal definition.
Not legally a zayna.
She's not legally a zayna. And therefore, because bestiality doesn't render the woman a zona, a warning that he issues, don't seclude yourself with X animal, is of no consequence, because the only warning is against a certain relationship that would cause her to become a zona. And bestiality wouldn't cause her to become a zona, as terrible and as horrible as it is. This is the Gemara's answer. Yeah. Yeah. Why the page is getting unclear.
Would she die at the hands of heaven though for that act?
Yeah, she might. There might be all kinds of consequences from heaven for that kind of behavior, but it doesn't turn her into a zona.
No. Just thinking there's other consequences for a while. Repercussions.
Sorry?
There's other repercussions for her.
There's certainly other repercussions.
This is not relevant. I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah. Okay, let's stop over here. And tomorrow we're going to get to, how do we know this? How do we know that bestiality doesn't render her a zona? How do we know that? And we're going to get into a little bit tomorrow. It's going to get connected to the laws of the carbon, about the esnan, right? The bechir kelev and the esnan zona, about what kind of animals count as offerings based on whether they came from harlotry, right? So when we get into that, we're going to get into a proof of defining the fact that a woman who engages in bestiality doesn't qualify as his own. So that will, God willing, come tomorrow. And then we're going to have to get to the flip side, which is when the verse says that the warning is issued in relation to Shivcha Zera, related to the capability that he has to seed her, how do we understand that verse? That we're going to get into as well tomorrow. Some more exciting things coming, right? But as I often do, when we do this kind of thing, we have to remind ourselves, this is Hashem's Torah, this is Hashem's logic, and the privilege we have to understand even a little bit of God's Torah is worthy of everything, as well as the fact, and I'd like to remind us also, that nothing is off the table in Talmud, and nothing is off the table in Torah. There's no subject that's, quote, too unholy. If it exists in this world, then we have to deal with it head on. We don't avoid it just because it happened. Maybe even more so, just because bestiality seems crazy to all of us, but it's a reality, it's a thing, and Torah is going to deal with it. We don't avoid, there's no topic off the table. Yeah. Okay. Have a wonderful day, Eden.
God bless you, Rabbi. You should go for your shikah. You should go from strength to strength.
A wonderful day.
Thank you, all the very best. Yeshua, all the very best to you.
To you too, Judge.
Have a good day.
Great day.
Thank you, so God bless you, Rabbi. Thank you.